Connaissance, recherche,
sciences,
des mathématiques,
théorie,
physique,
philosophie,
conférences,
archéologie,
nature.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Esther and the other organizers for inviting me and inviting Berthe to talk about this experience. Discussing yesterday, I was telling that Esther that I thought this idea of having a person who worked on evaluation of a specific program and the institutional counterpart, I thought was a very good one. And in this particular example, I think it gives me the possibility of, yes, talking about what I think is a really interesting program, which, as Esther was just saying, is part of a new wave of specific interventions aimed at the accumulation of human capital in developing countries, but also gives me the possibility of telling a story about the experience, the evaluation experience, which I think is for me at least, was very instructive. I learned a lot about many things, and I think it's not unusual as a story of the interactions between evaluators, maybe evaluators with an academic background, and the institutional counterparts. So the way we are organizing, we have organized with Berthe these presentations. I'll first talk about the antecedents and some of the results of the evaluation. Then Berthe will give her view about what were the impacts of the impact evaluation, if you like, and then I'll get back to talk a little bit about the politics of it. So that's the outline. So as Esther was saying, the particular program we're evaluating is what is known now as conditional cash transfer. So these are transfers targeted to poor families, and the transfer, which is cash, is not in kind, is conditioned to certain types of behavior, typical relating to education and health investments on the part of the household. Another important thing is that most of these transfers are targeted to women, and maybe I'll come back later a little bit to that. The first big programs of this kind were implemented in Mexico, Progresa, and Brazil, Bolsa Familia. The Progresa received much more visibility, mainly because of its evaluation. Progresa was started in 1997, and the Mexican government had the idea at the time, given that they were developing a large program, which was planned to cover, at the time, 10,000 villages in Mexico, covering a population of about 10 million individuals. They thought that they would like to evaluate it. And the way they did it was to use a randomized design, and to justify it from a political and ethical point of view, they said, well, we will not be able to cover 10,000 villages immediately for a number of logistic problems. It's going to take us about 2 years to get to that. So they identified an evaluation strategy. They have an evaluation sample of 506 communities, and they randomly assigned between early starters, where the program started in June 98, and late starters, where the program started in December 99. So that gave them a window of time during which they collected data so that they could compare a number of indicators and measure the impact on of the specific design on school enrollment, nutrition, consumption, etc. So it was a very well designed. And the evaluation that was commissioned by the Mexican government and executed by IFPRI, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., showed positive impact on a variety of outcomes and was very visible, both in the academic and in the policy world. I strongly believe that the evaluation was the main, and the visibility that the evaluation results had, was the main reason for the survival of the program. Now, in Mexico, every new president, which is Mexicans elect a new president every 6 years, and in the last 70 years, every new president would start a new program to fight poverty in rural Mexico. The first time that a program survived from a change of administration was in 2000 when Zedillo was replaced by Fox as a president, which, by the way, was a big change because it was the first time they changed political party. And nonetheless, the program survived. And survived also when Fox was replaced by Calderon in 2006. At the same time, there was, and this is something that I think is relevant for our discussion, there was a little bit of a backlash against randomization. I happened to be in Mexico City in January 2001, and this Reforma is the main newspaper in Mexico. It's the one with the widest circulation, and came out with a headline with an article against the evaluation, and especially against the randomization. And the main criticism was, so there was a little cartoon of this mad scientist with the swastika on his armband, and there was this argument about this mad social scientist experimenting on poor people the same way that Nazi guards were experimenting on Jews during World War II. It was pretty remarkable. And so the argument in the paper was saying, how can you ethically deny a benefit, is a program that has positive impacts on, say, child nutrition to poor families. And that caused a big resistance in Mexico against randomization. For instance, when I was involved with the evaluation of the urban expansion of Progresa, that eventually changed name to Oportunidades, to urban areas, to big urban centers, there was no question about randomizing. The guys in Mexico, they said, we would love to do it, but after all this, we just cannot do it. Now, I don't think this is an audience where I need to even respond to the type of criticism that were advanced by this journalist and the member of parliament in Mexico. But the answer is obvious. First of all, it's not clear. Without the randomization, they couldn't even have said that there was a positive impact. And moreover, the Mexicans were actually extremely careful about the ethics of all this. The evaluation was explicitly designed so not to deny anybody anything. It was based on the existing constraints and budget constraints, and exploited in a clever way the logistics problems posed by the expansion. Nonetheless, this backlash was a serious issue in Mexico. Now, why am I saying all this? Because this was relevant in Colombia, as we'll see in a moment. Now, after the Progressive success, conditional cash transfers became a bit of a fashion in Latin America, and they were and the big financial institutions, the World Bank and the IDB, start pushing them in a number of places. In 2000-2001, the Colombian government was working on a number of measures to deal with what was at the time the most severe crisis faced by the Colombian economy. There was a large increase in unemployment and increase in poverty and all that. So the World Bank and the IDB launched, gave a loan to the Colombian government for about $400 million, if I remember correctly, to finance 3 new interventions. The second and the third were a workfare program called Empleo en Accion, a job training program called Jóvenes en Acción, but the main one, the largest one, was Familias en Acción, which is a conditional cash transfer, pretty much like Progresa. The World Bank and the IDB insisted on having an evaluation, and in fact this was written in the loan that the Colombian government would have to spend roughly around 1% of the loan to evaluate the impact of these programs. And the evaluations were supposed to be nationally representative and were tendered internationally. So what was Familias en Acción? It was basically a carbon copy of Progresa. There was the same sort of targeting, which was first done at the geographically. So there were a number of towns that were deemed to be eligible, and then within the towns, they identified a number of eligible households. Now in Progresa, what they did was they had a special survey that identified within the locality who the poor or the poorest households were. In Colombia, they have a different targeting system since the early 80s. Is effectively every household in Colombia is supposed to be periodically assessed, and they're given a score, and on the basis of the score, you are given one of 6. We are assigned to one of 6 categories, so it's called CISBEN, and you're assigned category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that score basically determines your eligibility to all social programs. Now, Familias en Acción was targeted to CISBEN 1, which is the poorest, and there are effectively about the 20% poorest households. So to be eligible for Familias en Acción, you had to live in one of the towns for which the program was eligible. I'll tell you in a second a bit more about that. You had to be in CISBEN 1 as of December 99, and you had to have children, at least one child aged 0 to 17. There were 2 components, a nutrition component, which was for which you were eligible if you had any children between age 0 and 6. This is per household, not per child, and it's about $20 per month. And an education component, which was $14 per month per primary school child, so this is per child, and $28 per month per secondary school child. The conditions, so to get the nutrition one, you had to take the children to growth and development checkups periodically. And this was enforced quite seriously. The mothers had to participate into some social activities called Encuentro de Cuidados, which are meetings where mothers discuss issues that are relevant for that. My understanding is that this particular, unlike in Progresa, this was not enforced too strictly. The program was said to be incompatible with a pre-existing community nursery program for young children. So if you want to register one of your children or your children to the nutrition component and therefore get this $20, then you would lose eligibility for this community nursery. And I'll have to come back to that later. And as in Progresa, as in Mexico, the designers of this program were extremely worried about possible fertility effects on the program. So they say implicitly this is an incentive to have children. And so what they did was that only the children that were around at the moment the program was started were to give you eligibility. So if you would produce some new children, this would not enter the program. And I'll come back to that as well. For the older children, it's so much simpler. You have to enroll them in school and they have to attend classes. So the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, formed a consortium with 2 Colombian entities. One was a research/consulting institute called Econometria, and a data collection firm called SAY. And we wrote a proposal, and we bid for this evaluation, and we won the contract to do the evaluation. In the original proposal, the idea was to do something very much like Progressa, so exploit the expansion of the expansion phase of the program to randomize across geographically across towns. Once we got the contract, this was in December 2001, the terms of the contract were negotiated over a period of a few months between the consortium, the World Bank and the IDB, the President Office that ran the program, and Department of National Planning, where there is the unit that Berthe directs now. At some point, the person in charge of the program walked into a meeting in January 2002, and he said, "You want to randomize? Forget it. There's no way we're going to do that." And when we said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Because I say so." So there was so much for that. There were elections coming up in March 2002. That implied that the President's office was very worried about expanding the program as quickly as possible. And that particular administration and the people in charge of the program at the time, which are actually different from the people in charge of the program now, they were pretty much uninterested in the evaluation. And my understanding is that there was a complete lack of communication. I spent many hours talking to them. There was not a very good communication about why we're doing this. Now, the Department of National Planning and the World Bank and the IDB were very different, had a very different attitude, and indeed they were tremendously supportive of our efforts. So during these endless meetings, there were always discussions, and they were always on the right side, or whatever. So what was agreed during that failed meeting was that basically the government, the President's office, gave us a list of towns where they were going. 627 municipalities of the 1,000 municipalities that exist in Colombia. And so the criteria for the inclusion in this list, the town had to be with less than 100,000 inhabitants. They were not to be departmental capitals. There were a few that are with less than 100,000, so they were excluded. They had to have enough infrastructure in health and education. So a very small town, very isolated, were excluded. By the way, the same was true in Progressa. The reason for that is that if you have to comply with conditions, like sending your kids to school, there's better be a school around. And there to have this eligibility list, this SISBEN list, up to date to identify eligible things. And finally, there was a condition that there had to be a bank in town. This was important because the program, Colombia was in the middle of a civil conflict that at the time was raging very badly. Small towns in Colombia between 1999 and 2004-05 were, lots of them were very dangerous places. So the government thought that government officials could not go around with wads of cash to distribute to these people. So they had to have a bank where they could wire the money. And so that excluded a bunch of towns. It's interesting talking about whether this is going to be important for the evaluation, as you may imagine. There was one town that they had a bank, but was destroyed by a guerrilla attack, so they lost eligibility, and so they were among our controls. So we were told to extract, to draw the controls from the remaining towns. So what we did was they divided the treatment towns in 25 strata, which were defined by geography. So there were 5 main regions in Colombia, and by level of infrastructures in health education. Having done that, we drew 2 towns per strata, roughly, and that was our treatment sample. Then what we did was to match. In the same strata, we looked for similar town among the control population. So the control towns were similar to the treatment town in the sense they belonged to the same strata, so they were in the same area and the same level of infrastructure. Moreover, given the 2 towns that entered the treatment sample, we looked for towns that had the same kind of size and the same index of quality of life, which is periodically computed at the town level. So we matched on that. So typically, the most controlled towns that were controlled because they did not have a bank. In some cases, because the towns we drew were very small, we took 2 adjacent municipalities, especially in the Andean regions in Colombia. There are lots and lots of very small municipalities that are pretty much next to each other. So we ended up with a sample of 122 towns, of which 65 were controls and 50, or controls in inverted quote, and 57 treatments. We started planning a baseline survey for June-August 2002, and with the idea of doing follow-ups in 2003 and then 2005. Now, in late January 2002, with the presidential election coming up, the President's office called us again and said, we're going to start the payments everywhere now. So the idea is that we would collect a baseline, then a follow-up, and do some sort of diff-in-diff analysis. So that was going to go out of the window as well. So we were very frustrated, and there were a bunch of meetings. Now there, the role of Planificación Nacional and of the World Bank and the IDB was invaluable, because basically without them, this whole thing would have gone, we couldn't have done this. So effectively what we managed to convince in the end, after long, long negotiations, was to keep a number of towns out until they until we did the baseline survey. So so some of the treatment they did start in early 2002, and so when we went to field in June of 2002, they were already receiving payments, and but others unfortunately were kept out. So as a consequence of all this, the treatment sample was divided into what we call TSP, which stands for Tratamiento Sin Pago. So these were pure baseline data for the treatment sample, where at the moment of baseline there were no payments, and what we call TCP, because they were already receiving payments. So we used throughout all this exercise the difference in different methods with matching. Given the situation in the design of the data set, we put quite a bit of effort in introducing modules collecting retrospective information. Especially for school enrollment, this was quite feasible. And we collected what is a substantial database. So it's 122 towns, 11,500 households. This was combined with infrastructure surveys. So in each town we visited 2 schools and a health center, a hospital if it was there. Everything was matched with the administrative database from the sample. One other thing I'm still very proud of is that of the 11,500 households that we interviewed in 2002, in 2005 we matched them with the administrative data from the program on payments, and we couldn't find 100 households of the 11,000. So it was quite nice. There is a locality data set which gives information on prices, on various things that happens. This was done with the mayor and another selected informant, typically the priest or somebody else, the doctor, whatever. And we had a survey of our program officials. So it's a fairly extensive database, which is all available, by the way, publicly. And this was something that we had to negotiate, because The government said this is property of the Colombian government, nobody will be able to use it. And we negotiated a clause to our contract so that the data would become public, and it is now public can be downloaded from the BNP webpage. So the database was fairly substantive also because the household survey included many modules and lasted several hours. An average interview is about 3 hours. We had the consumption and expenditure modules. We have some information on food, individual food intakes by children. We have extensive labor supply time use data, detailed location data, so we know where this household lived relative to different landmarks in the town. We have subjective expectations data. We have anthropometric data, height, weight, and leg length. In the second follow-up, we added a module. We measured on hemoglobin on kids. In the second follow-up, we also did experimental games in 70 of the 122 towns to measure social capital. We had very low attrition between baseline and first follow-up, quite less than 6%, and quite decent between first and second follow-up, about 10%. So given the mobility of Colombia, this was quite good, we thought. So these are the typical size of the sample in the three database. Now let me give you a few impacts. This is enrollment rates by age of children with different measures for the overall sample. The blue is retrospective data, and the yellow and the red are baseline and first follow-up. Now these are impacts. As I said, all this, I'll show you a bunch of these impacts quickly because I want to give Berthe the opportunity to say a few things. But in terms of methodology, as I said, all this is different if we're matching, different types of matching. We cut this data in all sorts of different ways, and I think the results are quite robust. Incidentally, they are not too dissimilar from the results of the Progressa rural evaluation. Throughout the thing, I'll give you the results that we observed in first follow-up, which was, as I said, collected in a year later, in 2003, and second follow-up, which was collected between the end of 2005 and the beginning of 2006, so a few years after the beginning of the program. The second follow-up typically include all the observations. And always split between urban and rural. What do I mean by that? These are fairly small towns, as we saw from at the beginning. However, our sample was divided in two parts. There is 1/3 of the sample that lives in the urban center, what in Spanish is called the cabecera municipal. And then the rest, 2/3 of the sample is dispersed in the countryside. So there is a fairly marked, typically the people in the countryside are much poorer, they have larger families, all this type of things. So in terms of school enrollment, typically what you observe is that they are very small, if anything, effects for the younger children. So these are primary school age children, as in Mexico. Enrollment rates are pretty high at that, they are over 90%. So you couldn't have very large impacts anyway, and you don't. There is a little bit in rural. You have sizable effects for the older children, especially in rural areas, while the effects in urban are quite a bit smaller. Consumption increases. Especially in first follow-up, first receiving these things was 14-15%. What is remarkable, I thought, and it's actually, although it's a constant of many of these CCTs, is that the increase in food consumption is basically the same as the increase in total consumption proportionally. Now, if food is a necessity, you would expect food percentage-wise to increase by less than total. Now, throughout all the CCTs, this does not happen. for the economist in the audience, is as if you have in mind an angle curve which is downward sloping in terms of the share, the food share, it's as if there is a shift upwards of the angle curve induced by this program. So you don't go down, because systematically food increase at least as much. In the case of Colombia, you can see, say in first follow-up is 16% in urban and 14.7% in the total consumption. And so there is an increase in the food share. And the other thing to say is that they don't consume the entire grant. So they consume about 70–80% of the grant on average. And again, that's consistent with what has been observed in Mexico. So there is some evidence that they save some of this grant. There is quite a bit of an increase in the consumption of good foods for kids. These were the data on food intakes by young children. So it's the number of times in a week you eat eggs, beef, liver, whatever. And overall, all these are significant increases in the intakes of this type of foods. That's a nice. So there is no impact on vaccination, but vaccination is already pretty high. So we're not expecting a huge thing. This is the growth and development checkups. This is the. You can see there is a massive impact on the for the age group 48 to 84. This was data second follow-up. Now the kids that were younger, you don't find any impact. Why? Well, because those kids, as I mentioned, they were not in the program. These are new kids. And so the mothers don't have to take them to growth and development checkups for the conditionalities, and they don't, which was quite remarkable. These are the impacts on nutritional status. So these are Z-scores for height per age. Sorry, the second is weight per age. And last night I translated from Spanish to English, and I wrote height twice. So the third and fourth column is weight per age, and then is weight per height. And you can see both in height and weight, you do get an effect. These are children less than 6, and in rural areas you get 0.2. Say in height, 0.2 of Z-score, so of a standard deviation of Z-score, which is a big effect and quite remarkable. There is in rural, a fairly substantial decrease in the prevalence of diarrhea among young children, nothing in urban. So if you want a quick summary of the results, there is a sizable effects on education, especially for older children in rural areas. These are results I didn't show, some effects on children labor, and no effects on adult labor. Consumption increases, food consumption by the same amount, and not all grants is consumed. Good food intakes increase, and effect on children growth in rural areas. Some effects on the prevalence of diarrhea in rural areas. Now, one of the mandates of the evaluation, one of the things we negotiated, was the fact that we were also supposed to evaluate pre-existing program. That's what they told us to do. Now, it turns out that there was a program that was very big and very relevant for this population. It was a community nursery program called Hogares Comunitarios. And this was, at the time, considered by the government as an explicit alternative to Familias and Accion. So Familias and Accion was financed by the IDB and the World Bank for 3 years with a loan. They said, well, if we want to continue that, we have to find $100 million to pay for it. And so the prime candidate was this pot of money that was used for Hogares Comunitarios. So Hogares Comunitarios is a large program that was started in 1986. And was present in all of Colombia. So here, forget randomization, diff and diff, and all that. Every single municipality has this program. It covers about 1 million children. There are 80,000 of these little nurseries, and has never been evaluated. So where we did an IV approach, used distance from the nearest community nursery, conditional on the distance from other places, and that's what we got. This is, I have to go fast here, but if you look at the IV results, you get a fairly a massive effect of the program on children growth. So these were results that we presented at the same time as when we presented the results on Familias. We presented to the government the results on Hogares. So this was done in 2004. The event in 2004 was quite remarkable. We did this presentation in Bogota. It was organized by the Plan Nacional. There were about 500 people attending that presentation. And it was very visible in the press and everything. We had later a presentation for the president with explicit emphasis on this difference between Familias and Hogares. The second presentation in 2006, where we put more emphasis on limited effects in urban areas, was a much more private affair for the government. And at that time, we gave this was the time where they were considering expansion to urban areas, and the suggestion we gave was that they couldn't extrapolate the results to urban areas, the results we got, and they should evaluate them seriously with the pilot. And the office, Berthe has, is on the 36th floor of this tall building in Bogota. Very nice view.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the sponsorship to the College of France. I'm very happy to be here and to share a little bit. I'm going to talk about a little on the context, on the policy context of all this. It's quite different from what you heard yesterday, because this is like, I think, quite unique. Maybe one or two countries have this setup. So first, where do I come from? I am working at DMP, the National Planning Department, as Orazio was saying. And this is an agency which is like, let's think of it as the think tank of the government. So this is like kind of a place that survived the wave of state-led economies, in the 70s. Like almost all Latin America started planning departments. And some of them survived, very few, the 80s, and the National Planning Department is one of those, with Brazil, the Brazilian agency as well. So it is like interesting that we had this institution, and that nowadays works like a think tank of the government. So that's the basic spirit where they started the National Planning Department. What is Sinergia, which is also a quite unique institution? Sinergia is like the system of evaluation and monitoring that the government set up, that the Colombian government set up. And then this is a unit within the National Planning Department, and that's the unit I am heading now. So now let's say, why the Familias and Accion evaluation? Why did this happen? And as Orazio was saying, there were like, I think, three things that were going on in the moment. And first, there was a broader institutional process of setting up or constructing an M&E system, monitoring and evaluation system run by the government. And this was like at the beginning of the 90s, and I'm going to explain why did this happen in a moment. Second, we had a crisis, an economic crisis, very strong economic crisis at the end of the 90s. There wasn't any safety net in place in that moment. So the government, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. This was another one of the causes, very important for the need of a social program, a fast social program that can reach all these populations that were hit by the crisis. And then the involvement of the multilateral development banks. I think it's another very important issue, as Orazio was saying, because they had the experience of the previous evaluations, especially the Progressa one. And they were very involved in helping during the crisis. They were providing lots of financing to the government, and that gave them the window of opportunity to ask for the evaluations of the programs. So those three aspects, I think, are the reasons behind the evaluation of Familias and Accion. So why the government started building monitoring and evaluations institutions? And I think this all comes up to the reform, to the new social agreement that was done in Colombia in the early 90s. We had like a new constitution. We had an assembly to write a new constitution, and the constitution tried to give more participation to the citizen, to the citizen before the state, and they redefined the role of the state, and it included some provisions so that the public servants should be more accountable to the citizens. So that's one of the reasons. And Law 152 in 1994 gave the DMP the mandate of evaluation. So they specifically said that the government should evaluate the programs and should start a monitoring system to be accountable for the results. So the government started to work on that in the mid-90s. They started to think about evaluations, but self-evaluations, so the agencies will become and evaluate their programs by themselves. Afterwards, they also included just performance monitoring indicators for the programs run by the different agencies. And then finally, that consisted, or that provided a little conceptual basis for what we have today. The system was formally created in '94. Well, in 2000, as I was telling you, at the end of the 90s, we had the crisis, the economic crisis, and then the banks came to provide funding for different, and to try to launch a new safety net because we didn't have it. So the safety net comprised three programs, as Orazio was saying. The three programs were the Familias and Accion, the Conditional Cash Transfer, the Empleo en Acción, the Workfare program, and then the Job Training program. And these programs were seen as key interventions to be evaluated by the multilaterals. They indeed included in the loans budget for these evaluations, 1%. So who was going to carry out the evaluations? They needed some counterpart in the government, and we were there. This little office that had been started 5 years before, without much experience on evaluation or anything, but anyway, it was there, and it was a counterpart for the banks and for the managers of the program. So they started a little group there. The group that handled the evaluation was initially in the agency that ran the program. So the agency that ran the program is the presidential agency. It's a different one. But then they came back, they were integrated into the MP later, and that will become the group that manages the evaluations nowadays. Finally, the evaluation of Familias, which was started in 2001, would become the primary example of evaluation that would have a tremendous demonstrative effect on the use of evaluation. And then the role of the MP was formalized. So this has been evolved during the last years. Today we manage an evaluation agenda that is carried out on a yearly basis, more or less, and also over a span of 2 or 3 years, more or less. There is an intersectoral evaluation committee, which is the body that oversights the agenda, that makes the priority of the programs that are going to be evaluated. We currently have approximately 24 evaluations finished since 2007. They're not all impact evaluations. We also do other kind of evaluations. And right now there are 17 evaluations ongoing. All this was finally formalized in a 2004 policy statement. So now evaluation is a fundamental part of the mission of DMP. This is just some quotes of some former DMP directors and people that they recognize, and it's well known that evaluation is one of the major parts in the mission of DMP. So what is our role specifically right now? So we're like kind of an intermediary. My office is like the intermediary between the program that is under evaluation and the external evaluator. The program that is under evaluation is, of course, managed by either like the ministry and agency or any of the institutions in the government. The external evaluation is usually a consulting firm. It's an external evaluation consulting firm. It's a research center, different. What do we try to do? We try to guarantee independence. We are evaluating programs of the government. So it is difficult, there could be a conflict of interests because we are being, some people say you are evaluating your stuff. But what we try to do is that DMP is there in the middle of the ministry, that is the one that is really executing the program, and in the and intermediating with the external firms so that they can say what they need to say, that they can observe that they can keep their independence. So that's our role. Also, doing a standardization of contracting processes, also maintaining the methodological rigor. Many agencies, many ministries want to make the evaluations by themselves, but they don't. They don't really have the methodological rigor, or they just don't know. We have had many impact evaluations that are so-called impact evaluations, but they don't even consider a control group or something like that. So that's what we try to do, and we also try to build capacity in the public sector. So we make courses and we do training and that stuff. So the case of Familias and Accion, very, very quickly. As I was saying, it was very influential. Why was it so influential? I think, first, what was in it for the managers? Let's think about incentives. Why would someone come and want to be evaluated? Well, first, we had the banks behind, that's for sure. But also, I think the managers realized that there was a chance for them to get lots of visibility from the program. The progress had given the government and the managers lots of visibility. So it was a good example. There was a need to, the government of Uribe has just arrived. So the program indeed started during the Pastrana administration in the end of from 98 to 2002. When Uribe took office, they needed a social program. They needed one program that could underpin social policy, and they were looking for something. And in fact, I think the results of the evaluation contributed a lot for Familias to survive first the government, the transition of government, and second, to become the program selected to underpin the social policy. And this was important for the managers, of course. And finally, after that, the program, of course, got extensive diffusion, dissemination, and in academia, government, and multilateral circles. Afterwards, the expansion of the program was justified using the evaluation's results. But more than that, what I would say is what we learned and how we use the results of the evaluation, because this is very important from the government point of view. We invested $2.5 million in this evaluation, and we needed to know that this was useful for something. So these are some of the features that we shaped upon the results of the evaluation in the program, and then some of them are very had lots of impact and were very important, like removing the non-eligibility of municipalities without banking, like removing the non-eligibility of the beneficiaries of the nursing program, as Orazio was saying, like reducing subsidy amounts for primary education. This is something very important. As you saw in the graphs before with the impact, basic education had already very high rates of attendance, so there was no much point of investing more money in the basic, in subsidies, so that kids would remain in school if they were already going to school. So what we tried to do was reduce the amounts for primary and switch that money to increase the amounts for secondary subsidies, so that there were more incentives for the kids that had more opportunity costs to go to school, to remain in school. So we introduced different modalities for the subsidies in the urban expansion, and that increased the amount of the subsidy gradually during the last years of schooling, and also that introduced some prices. So some prices for transition, some prices for graduation that I'll show you in a minute. And finally, the evaluation as a public good. I think this is important as well. The Familias database is public, as Orazio was saying, and it's becoming a source of information, and it's becoming a source in theme studies, of more research, and it's being cited in many different studies. So I think that's a good externality. And finally, of course, we encourage the use of these external databases. Finally, other evaluations originated upon the experience. So some of the further avenues of research, the community nursery program was evaluated. After these initial results that Orazio showed on the hogares comunitarios, we decided to carry out an evaluation, and that is ongoing. Of course, just as he said, the program is almost universal. It is not a random evaluation or so. It has used instrumental variables and other techniques, but it's been evaluated. It's almost finished, and we have some results for that. It's a huge evaluation, like 20,000 children sample. We had the urban pilots, these two municipalities. We tried to do some randomization in those. We started with the municipality, with the little town of Soacha, and we had there the randomization, but afterwards this sample was lost because in the middle of the political campaign and the expansion, they entered to the controls in Soacha, so we lost that. Then we had the pilot of social capital in Cartagena. This is a small pilot running experiments to see if the program had any impact on social capital, because, you know, as Orazio was saying, we had these mothers' encounters, and it's been argued that those encounters can foster or have big effects on social capital, and that's what we wanted to know there. Then we have banking services, which is, of course, as we were saying, introducing banking services, introducing electronic cashiers, like cash and everything. Then we had the Familias en Accion for displaced population. There was this idea that, you know, we had a very big displacement problem in Colombia, and there was the idea that we needed to know if Familias could be suited as an intervention for those populations. So we wanted to know as well, so we started an evaluation to see if Familias could be an intervention that was helping anyway the displaced population, because the constitutional court indeed has mandated that the displaced population would have priority on all social programs, so they were getting anyway Familias en Acción on a priority basis. Finally, some early childhood interventions, cognitive development and nutrition that Orazio is working on as well, and the urban expansion of Familias en Acción. And this last example, the urban expansion, so these are the modalities we wanted to try. So we wanted to know, as I was saying, the prices, different incremental modalities of the subsidies, especially for secondary. This is incremental, and this has the prices, and that's what we try to do for the next evaluation. We have assigned different municipalities, the different modalities, and we'll see what are we going to get, because we understand that the urban expansion should be treated differently, that we cannot extrapolate the results, and that's what we want to know, even though this has been very difficult. And this was a sample done in 2007, already split with the two modalities, but then we'll see if we can keep the samples to finish the evaluation. Finally, some dissemination. What we do is we try to make these reports that are friendly, and to write what we found and what are the main takeoffs of the programs. And this is the last, the one in front is the one from Familias en Acción, and that's another part of our job. Some closing remarks very quickly. Institutionalization of evaluation meant that significant public resources and efforts are devoted to evaluation. So we have gotten support from the multilateral banks, and they have helped us earmark some resources. However, in the government, we need to show that what we are getting out of these investments, of this money invested in evaluation. We cannot have the studies to to rest on the shelves. We need the studies to show that they are having an effect. There's lots of money, lots of public money. The impact evaluation has made huge contribution against the anecdotic culture, of course. It has given us the evidence we needed to make changes to the programs. That's what we want in the end, to make changes, to make the programs more efficient, more better programs. But there are always questions like the one, why is it so expensive? We already knew that. We could spend that in more subsidies, more housing, more breakfast, more anything. So it's difficult. We are in the middle of that. We have to convince the managers to tell them, look, we have to sell them the evaluations. That's my work, to prove that it is useful for something, that it will help them to have better programs, to manage better their programs, and overcome their reluctance. They are sometimes afraid of the results. If the results are wrong, what I'm going to say, how can I handle it? And then if the press gets into it, and then they make bad use of the results. So that's something that we are struggling all the time with. So we need to provide the managers with incentives to engage into evaluation. We need to know that the what is not enough, that they have big expectations on the why, on the mechanisms, on the how. Sustained demand for evaluation rests on this, on being able to answer those expectations. So we need to reinforce early piloting for variations in design, simulations, good simulations, because we cannot experiment with everything. If we have 10 variables in a program, and 2 choices, that gives us 2 to the 10 combinations. How can we try to, test for everything in real life? So we need simulations, development of structural models behind. There are also quality constraints, as we said, difficult to randomize just for the political reasons, but maybe at the individual level it's more unfeasible. At the village or some bigger unit is more feasible. Quality heterogeneity within non-experimental IEs. There are lots of methodological caveats with the non-experimental. And finally, we also need to better understand replicability, extrapolation of results, both over time and across environments. And finally, impacts take time. Decision makers often do not wait long, so they're always pushing for results, for what should I do, what should I do. Decisions need to be taken on real time sometimes. So we need to complement the impact evaluations with other type of evaluations, rapid assessments, desk reviews, baseline analysis, even if it is possible. And finally, the impact evaluations results inform but do not replace political decisions. We are in an environment highly politically sensitive. Sometimes there are political situations that we cannot fight with. The coming elections, whatever, the expansion, the rapid expansions, like you do what you can, but it informs, like the political decisions have political nature, political motivations behind, and it's economic, political economy. That's why the political economy is in there. So that's it.
So let me conclude this with. I think you get an idea of the interactions and the various actors. So where do we stand now? In terms of the CCT agenda, I think we had a program that has been shown to be successful in some contexts. I quite strongly believe that the program that was developed at the beginning in rural Mexico and also in Colombia, was done mainly in rural or small towns, needs a fair amount of redesign for expansions to urban areas. In fact, what we have in terms of evaluation results to urban areas, the effects are pretty modest, even in Mexico, not only in Colombia. So one probably needs to work on the structure of the grants and also on the conditionalities that you impose on the households, if you want conditionalities. And also, I think many of these programs are mature and now looking at the next challenges. Even where they have been successful in increasing the demand for investment in human capital, you need to look at the quality of that investment, that early childhood development is an important area. Quality of services of health and education I think, is one of the biggest challenges that is faced now by many of these programs. Now, I wanted to link up to some of the things that Berthe said in terms of how do I see the experience we had in Colombia. So probably it is true that the evaluation results had some impact on where the policy went. I think the evaluation was very instrumental in the government choice of Familias has become the main social program in Colombia. And this is good and bad in the sense that they did listen to some things, and Berthe was mentioning some, like they removed the conflict of eligibility with hogares comunitarios, they removed the non-eligibility of the young children, they start thinking about restructuring the grants. On the other hand, it was pretty clear that I think, to be realistic, the expansion was justified on the basis of say, oh, there is an evaluation that shows good impacts. And they were pretty adamant, the government was pretty adamant in that. Now, the reason they did it, I think, is because Familias and Accion, like many of these conditional cash transfer programs, is an extremely rentable program from a political point of view. I mean, I personally think that both in the case of Lula and in the case of Uribe, if they won re-election, was to a considerable extent, not exclusively, but I think these big conditional cash transfer programs play a big role. I mean, I've been in situations where it's clear that having the president on TV handing out checks can be very popular, and that gets into the way to a proper design, because at that point the priority becomes the expansion of the most visible things of the program, and an example is this. Berthe was alluding to that. At some point we designed quite carefully the pilots both in Soacha and Medellin, but the Soacha one was pretty nice, and subsequently the expansion to several urban towns, and that was based on a randomized design and everything. And then in 2006 the elections were happening, and the president's office just decided to cover everywhere, control treatment, they just didn't care. And in a way it was a real pity, because quite a bit of data had been collected for baseline thing, and it's not clear what will be possible to do with that data. I mean, okay, it's nice to have data, but it was a pity. So that's a sombering note, I think. Mexico, by the way, has been very different. It's true there was this backlash, but the one thing that I noticed in Mexico is that the Oportunidades, as Progresa now is called, has managed to isolate themselves from the political process, from the executive, fairly effectively. Just the symptom is, both in Colombia and in Mexico, registrations into the program are a leading indicator of elections. However, the Granger causality goes the opposite way, in the sense that in Mexico, 9 months before any elections, any important elections, they stop registrations into Oportunidades with the explicit thing that they want to make clear that this is not, has to be isolated from the political process, cannot be used to buy votes. So they are very explicit. They say, this is a cost, but it's a cost that we have to have. We cannot link the registration into Oportunidades to the political process. In Colombia, it's the opposite. Whenever there is an election, there is a big, 6 months before, there is a big expansion of, I mean, I have 2 or 3 data points, so it's, but the R² is 1. Now, that's a summary note. There are a couple of things just to enlighten a little bit. I think the CCTs have been having lots of effects, and some of them are not being studied or appreciated completely. I think that this stuff of the money is given to women actually does have a huge impact. And there are now a number of studies that show that. And I think that's extremely important. And I could talk for hours about that, so I'll stop here. But also this stuff on social capital, I think these interactions, and I think that's another interesting byproduct that should be better appreciated and understood. Now, having said all these things and having told all the horrible meetings and the fights and the things about the nature of the nature, I think things have improved a lot. I keep going to Bogota and and work with the Colombian government on this, and I think it's much easier to sell and proper evaluations now than it was 6 years ago when we started this. We are working on a big evaluation of a new welfare program called Juntos, which is similar to Chile Solidario. And although there are lots of political difficulties in it, I think the scheme that we have now is based on a random assignment at some level, and has been, we were able to, the difference relative to the early one, our counterpart then was saying, what are you talking about? We don't understand this. Now they say, okay, there are political constraints, but let's see what we can do together. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.